Shout on, pray on, we're gaining ground. Glory, hallelujah, the dead's alive and the lost is found. Glory, hallelujah.
Welcome back to Eschatology Matters. Eschatology Matters can be found on the Fight Laugh Feast Network, and we're also on Boniface Media. As we get going, I want to mention again to you that if you want to start reading the Puritans, but you don't know where to begin, check out Puritan Treasures for Today from Reformation Heritage Books. This series makes the riches of these godly writers of old accessible for the modern reader. With updated language and helpful introductions, these classic works from John Owen, Jeremiah Burroughs, and more are the perfect starting point for the curious reader. Learn more today about Puritan Treasures at heritagebooks.org/Puritan Treasures. And if you're in the cart, enter the code EMATTERS for 10% off your order of the Puritan Treasures series. Today, I'm joined again by Dave Schrock. Dave, I want to jump right in, but thanks so much for joining us again, brother.
So good to be with you, Josh.
Yeah, so Dave, you've been on at least a couple of times, but give everybody, brief capstone. Where are you at? What are you up to?
Yeah, so I pastor in Northern Virginia, Occoquan Bible Church. Been here for almost 10 years. Do some teaching of theology at Indianapolis Theological Seminary. Have also done that for 10 years. And also one of the leaders for Christ Over All online ministry.
Yes. So Christ Overall is kind of the inspiration for today's episode. So you guys do, I constantly recommend your content. It's a great channel slash I don't know, like it's mainly article format, right? Christ Overall.
Right. So it's online resources. So we're publishing short, long form, and then we have a podcast.
Right. Okay. Yeah. It's usually the long form pieces I find myself recommending, but it's got great content. You guys do like a lot of series, thematic studies on things. I find it super helpful and it keeps the content fresh. But you guys did one on graveyards.
Yeah.
So every so often I'll see something pop up online and it's something that's been percolating in my mind for a few years. This particular one was a comment, and I'll get there, but it was a comment I heard somebody make one time and I thought, well, that's interesting. And it's just percolated, but I never actually put pen to paper, and I wouldn't have put pen to paper as well as you guys did in this article. So this article popped up. We'll put it in the show notes, but it was talking about graveyards and the importance of graveyards for the church. First of all, I want to get into the article and kind of talk through it a little bit, but like, where did this idea come from? Why'd you guys talk about grave? Yeah. It's not even October, by the way.
Yeah, that's right. It might have been a conversation that was had in class in August of this last year. So teaching eschatology, I will often end up talking about cosmology, and there might have been on anthropology. I actually can't remember which doctrinal loci it was, but it came up in the importance of having a church graveyard. And until even getting to write this letter, I would call it a church cemetery, because I hadn't been schooled enough to realize, oh, graveyards are what churches do. Cemeteries are what more public spaces for the dead are. And so that's something I learned along the way. And someone on X said, hey, you do realize that it's not a church cemetery, but a church graveyard. I was like, well, I do now. Doing some studying there. But Nate Hendrickson wrote a paper in class for this. And so he and I worked on this together. So doing some teaching on it in class, then he kind of amplified that. And then we kind of amplified it together for this finished product.
Perfect. Yeah. So graveyards, because I think most of us in the West, in America, probably didn't go to a church with a graveyard in front. So let me just walk you into this. So when I saw the article, one of the first things I thought of was again the percolations in my own mind. But I also started thinking of churches that do have graveyards, and they're typically old and they're typically not used a lot. So I was thinking of like, there's a country church near where my wife grew up. It has a graveyard. It has no people at the church anymore. Most of the churches I've been at don't have graveyards and have no intention of. I don't know what you guys like. Did you encounter any of that pushback? Like, are there churches that are doing this well at this point, or is this sort of an anomaly in Western churches?
I think this is a pretty novel idea as we sit here in 2025. I think about the church planting that's taken place, at least in my lifetime, and they're just trying to find a space.
Yeah.
There's not much thought about that. And part of that is the urban context. Certainly churches that are an urban center, it becomes more difficult to be able to do that. Where our church is, we don't have space to do this, right? So I'm writing an article that is aspirational more than putting pen to paper after something that we have done. Now, Nate is actually at a church in Indiana that has had this conversation. They have a large property, and they've thought about this. I think it's stalled. I'm not sure where it is for that church, but at least least they're having an active conversation about it.
Okay, yeah. And I know we've had church members, for example, that came from churches that it was almost like a perk of membership for those churches that they would be interred in the graveyard of the church if they were a member in good standing, those sort of things. But yeah, I first heard this. I remember I'll keep his name out of it, but it was public figure, and I was at a little conference that they were doing at his church, and he had remarked, he was getting older in age, and he remarked that he had asked the church to build a graveyard. That was like his, I think he might have said cemetery to be fair. But anyway, to build a graveyard out front, not in the
Hmm.
back of the church, but in the front, and that's what he had asked them to do before he died. And it started percolating at that point because he introduced it as a means of hope for the Christian, which is sort of what your article kind of
Yeah.
jumped into. I don't know if you had anything to
Well,
add
yeah,
on
yeah,
that
no,
one.
I think that's right.
Yeah.
I mean, last year I think I preached, it was Easter Sunday, and it's interesting. We preached outside, so we were in our parking lot, and if you stand outside our parking lot, look to the right, you will see a gas station. But on the other side of the gas station, in front of the veterinarian shop, there's a family graveyard. So in Northern Virginia, there are graveyards all over the place, and I think it's something that we can easily forget. But it really should be, and this is one of the points of the article, was it really should be something that we put in front of people again. Because in our secular age, death is something that people want to turn a blind eye to. And really, the Christian gospel, the Christian message is no, death is coming.
Yeah.
Uh, do you have hope on the other side of the grave? Do you have hope in a resurrection? And, a graveyard puts that in front of members and a community as well when it's done right.
Yeah. I want to read through the 7 points you guys made because one of them stuck out to me.
Mhm.
And I'm going to ask you here on the spot because I didn't tell you this in advance to just defend this point. Now, I want to
Yeah.
talk about it a little bit, but I was thinking too of the graveyard. There's certain things that seem strange that they're not normal for the church. So I've always felt this is just my personal take on things. I've always felt that it's unfortunate when weddings are typically associated with external venues as opposed to the church itself. All the qualifications out there. I understand some churches can't, put that many people in their church. Lots of reasons that may happen. But I think it's just typically the expectation of a lot of Christians, at least in America in 2025, that like they don't instinctively think toward the church when they think, oh, I need to get a minister from the church, but they don't think of having it at the church instinctually. The same could be said of graves and graveyards and also funerals, right? Like these are typically a third party affair. This is somewhere we go down the road for this, and then Lord willing, they come back and maybe you have a luncheon for the family or something at the church. But the church, as far as that interment and that final declaration, is sort of bifurcated away from it. Which is why I found it really compelling that you addressed it as an eschatology question, because this is an eschatology question, and it's a lot more than just a picture, I think.
Mhm. Yeah, I think
Um,
that's right. I mean, so again, the Lord can raise a person wherever they are, right? I mean, if their body has been chopped up and distributed all around Israel, like the concubine was in the Old Testament, that body can be raised to life again, will be raised to life again. So I certainly think we need to have that in mind.
yeah,
Secondarily, I wouldn't want someone to feel an overwhelming sense of guilt if that's exactly what they do, right? Where they go and the body is buried at a when I served in Indiana, there was both a graveyard, a city graveyard, city cemetery, right across from the church. So I lived at a parsonage next to the church. I would look out my window, and I always thought if there was going to be a tornado that would come through Indiana, it would come through that cemetery and right into our house because it would be coming from that direction. So that was one. And then down the street, there was another one, a Riverview Cemetery. And we had many members who were buried there. And it would be, you go back to the church and you would celebrate that. Many times the service, the funeral service itself would be at the church, go to the funeral, go to the interment, and then come back. So again, I wouldn't want someone to heap guilt on someone who that's the pattern that they have.
right.
However, I do think it's something that churches should think about, that they wouldn't just be outsourcing the removal, the burial of the dead.
Yeah.
I mean, certainly there is a vocation for, used to be an undertaker or someone who's a mortician today, someone who's a funeral home director. So there's a vocation for that. I don't think the church needs to get into that business, but there is something to be said about coming to church and being with the church militant that gathers to worship Christ and to pass through the graves of those who are the church triumphant. triumphant, those who are now assembled around the throne of God. And I think too often when we gather and we worship, we are unaware of the fact that we are joining the saints now made righteous, the righteous saints now made perfect, who are seated around the throne, that we are coming to Mount Zion, as Hebrews 12 tells us. And there's a reality to that that a church graveyard helps us to embrace and to embody.
Yeah. And I think it's also, when you see an old church and you see the graveyard in front, at least me growing up, I thought, well, that's strange. It looks out of place, right? As opposed to normative. And like you said, this isn't to heap guilt onto people at all. It's just I think more than anything, it's encouraging for us to think about how we build the message of Christian hope. So one of the things that we've talked about, and I think this is a good example because not every church can build a cathedral, right? Like if you're a 3-year church plant, you're not looking to build some Gothic cathedral, but when they used to make those buildings, many have written, a lot about the architecture, the way, the steps would be uneven or maybe too tall for natural footsteps, and it was to make you strain as you walked up them. The door would be heavier in order to, show it is by effort one walks in the light of Christ type thing, and then you'd have the vaulted ceilings. And it was to direct your eyes to the glory of God that beams down. Like every bit of the architecture spoke. And it wasn't just like it was a cute picture. It was actually like a means through which God was instructing and building his people. Part and parcel of that was you walked through the graves, like you just said, of the departed saints. This is the church militant walking, like that you passing through this picture of we walk in life because of Christ, and there's hope beyond the grave for these saints. All that gets just robbed when we don't even consider those with churches.
Yeah, I mean, we're just living today in kind of a de facto Gnosticism in most evangelical churches, that material things are not something that we're thinking about for the purposes of the glory of God, right? We have rightly understood that the gathered church is the church body, the body that is gathered, and the building is not that. And yet I think we have undersold the importance of the building that is there, right? Recent conversation, just hearing about the ways that, it doesn't matter what happens to that building. It doesn't matter what takes place in that space, because what matters is the gathered saints who are there. And there's a kernel of truth in that. And I think there's a whole lot of misunderstanding that there is something that is sanctified, that is taking place there. Not in an Old Testament sense, right? We're New Covenant Christians, but there is a sense in which that these material places do, have a sense of history, have a sense of purpose. They're teaching something. And again, if you have an ugly church building, you are unintentionally teaching something about what we put our value in. There's a whole different debate on, if we had a different tax structure, what we'd be able to do with the money that we're able to give to the church and everything else like that. But there is something to be said about actually investing in beauty, that draws our minds, our hearts, our affections to the Lord. I think that's something that we don't consider very often in what I'll just call our de facto Gnosticism of modern evangelicalism.
Yeah. I've oftentimes, it seems like it comes through with that word just, fill in the blank. The church is just, or the building is just a building. Like if you apply that to most things in church, you're probably going to get it wrong. Because yes, like you just said, yes, it's a building, but it's not just a building. It actually matters. One of the things that was going through my mind while you were talking is just, we've been preaching through Joshua here at our church, and God's a God who claims ground and says that the ground you stand on is holy. Now, Old Testament, Old Covenant, New Covenant, I get, all the distinctions we can make there, but at the same time, God's a God who is concerned with things and works through, by his grace and for his glory, he works through these things, including graveyards. It's not just a graveyard where we put somebody. Let me read through this list, because number 6 was the one that kind of keyed me in, and I would love to hear your thoughts on this one. So here's the list of 7 things that you guys brought up in this article. We're going to try to link to the article on the website, or excuse me, on our podcast, our feed, or however we post these things. So here's the 7. Number 1, church graveyards bear witness to the reality of death. Number 2, they can be formative for pastors and churches. Number 3, they are testimonies of hope and the resurrection. Number 4, they illustrate the gathering of Zion. Number 5, they remind the church militant of the church triumphant. Here's the one that I thought was interesting. Number 6, they bear testimony to the presence of Christ's church in a given land. And then number 7, they offer church members a place of rest. We hit a couple of these already. I know you kind of, and we could talk a lot about them, but you talked about Mount Zion and approaching Zion's hill, and you talked about church militant, church triumphant. Talk me into a little bit How do graveyards bear testimony to the presence of Christ's church in a given land?
That's just my backwards way of affirming Christian nationalism. Is that what that is?
I actually wasn't going there on this one, but I just thought it was interesting.
Yeah, I mean, here's the thing. Again, I think it's six. I think there's six graveyards, six cemeteries from my house to our church. And I know that one of them was a Presbyterian church that gathered halfway between my house and the church. And, you know, it was interesting because a couple of years ago, I was reading through Ian Murray's Revival and Revivalism, or Revival and Revivals, whatever the title is for that. And he talked about the revivals that took place in the very late 1700s, early 1800s in Virginia. I was like, oh, well, that's here. You know, I mean, I've driven through, you know, on the way to Richmond where some of those places were taking shape, and I think this was one of those churches that actually bore witness there. Or in a different location down the street, you have the Bacon Race Cemetery, where Occoquan Baptist Church used to be a part of that. And so that tells a history that 250 years ago, Christ was being named in this place, and there's an ongoing testimony to that fact. And
Yeah.
so, yeah, I mean, the mission before us today is not just to be historians, but it is to say that, like, the gospel has, God has answered his people's prayers. He has promised that he is going to go into the nations and he's going to make disciples,
Yeah.
right? How do we understand that? Like, this is a testimony that in this place, for this time, these people were worshiping Christ in this place. And when that final trumpet sounds, those bodies are going to be raised to life and they're going to be brought into, you know, physical resurrection on that last day. And so the presence of Christ in that place is testified by the presence of that graveyard or that cemetery. And so even as we're, you know, experiencing something of a vibe shift today or something of, you know, a recognition, like, no, America is not just an economic zone. It's not just a principle set of principles. Like, it's actually a people who many had a Christian understanding of the world. Well, that history helps us to be able to think through today, how does Christ and his gospel, Christ and his people continue to have impact on culture? And I would say first and foremost, we continue to preach the gospel, but I'm actually preaching this Sunday that extending out from gathering for worship at the altar, at the church, there should be an impact that we have on culture today. And one of the things that kind of speaks to a culture 50, 100, 200 years ago are the graveyards that are there. That's a culture forming reality in that place.
Yeah. And I feel like it's a good, because if somebody's listening to this and they're thinking, well, I can't build a graveyard, and maybe you can, and that'd be great if your church could take on that. But a lot of churches, I suspect, you know, financially or like you said, you know, just geographically, they can't take that on. But I think it should key us in on if we can't have the graveyard right now, we should be preaching that message. We should really be intentionally communicating something that we have lost because, you know, you were just mentioning it being like little memorials, you could think of them. Again, I've been in Joshua, so my mind's on, you know, they're
Oh,
grabbing
yeah.
stones out
Yeah.
of the
Yep.
riverbed and they're stacking them for a memorial, and it says it's so their children would look and ask, what is this thing that God has done? Um, but if you're thinking of graveyards, you know, if I can like really rip off, I think it was Lewis's phrase of nothing buttery, you know, it's nothing but a graveyard. If that's the world we live in, and I think I would agree with you, whether you call it nothing buttery or Gnosticism, it is the world looks at the church and the answers for the eternal state that only God's word provides and only his people are entrusted in through the church. Like, we have the only message of hope in these circumstances, and yet the graveyard and oftentimes the ceremony associated with that graveyard, the funeral, they're just removed.
Mhm.
If nothing else, I think that should lead believers to say, okay, we have lost a very public witness that we have to supplement elsewhere. We have to communicate this message, even if we can't geographically, financially, whatever reason, we can't build one now. We have to actually have that message at the forefront. And that's just a message I don't hear from Christians a lot. Let me tell you about death.
Well, yeah, absolutely. So we think today, you know, and I've been a part of this, you know, founding a seminary in Indianapolis. So churches working together to do that. It's an institution that is thinking about the future, that is preparing the way for men to be, you know, trained as pastors in the future going forward. Well, actually, I think local churches, so this is not an article, we're thinking about it now, local churches, and this could even cross denominational lines, right? Local churches could work together to say, we're going to buy a plot of ground, and this is going to be a space where we actually actually, bury the dead. Because we live in a day when, again, the cost is prohibitive for some to do these things, but that's all they're thinking about, right? Their moral imagination has only been shaped on how many dollars and cents it costs to put someone, to dispose of a dead body. When in fact, no, like there should be something that is remembered about this person. What a gift it is for a child or a grandchild to be able to go to a place and to say, this is where my ancestor lives. Right. Just the other day, or I guess it was a couple months ago, Trent Hunter, who works with me at Christ Overall, we found out that our ancestors are actually from the same county in southern Michigan. And so he was going back there to bury his father in Constantine, Michigan. And he was calling me or texting me from a gas station grocery store that's in White Pigeon, Michigan, which is literally a stone's throw away from where my grandparents are buried and where my folks will be buried when they die in the future. And it's like there's something about that interment of the body in that place that actually connects the two of us who are living today. And at the same time is also recognizing like I can go to that place. And we live again in such a plastic age that we don't have, things that we keep for a long time. Heirlooms and fine china, those are gone, right? It's here today, gone tomorrow. We treat the body in the exact same way. And I think we really need to recover a theology of the body to be able to appreciate some of these things.
No, that's exactly okay. This is exactly what I was wanting to key in on because there's a lot of things that play into this, right? So I don't want to just broad brushstroke it, but in the back of my mind, it was like, okay, I have everything I have to like, the 80s were better. We both know this. So if something was made in the 80s, it lasted. Today, it's like this has a 2-year shelf life. It's going to break and it's okay because it's cheap and it's made to break. So I was wondering like how much of this is a cultural thing. So here's something Luther said in Table Talk. I thought this was really interesting, and obviously Luther living in a day where I would suspect death was a little bit more at the forefront of his thinking than for most people's thinking.
Yeah.
This is what Luther said. He said, quote, "We must henceforth learn a new language and special speech in talking of death and the grave when we die. It should not be called dying, but being sown for the coming summer, and that the churchyard or burial mound is not a mound of dead bodies, but an acre full of grain, called God grain, which is to sprout again. So then, when I see my father, mother, child, or friend buried and lie under the ground, I, as a Christian, should not say, 'There lies a foul, decayed carcass or corpse,' but 'There lies my dear father, mother, child, or friend, and today or tomorrow I shall lie there with them. What are they? Pure kernels of grain, which will grow immortal and imperishable." End quote. Um, when I was thinking about your article, this came to mind because could we say that that's the message of the Christian church, or is it frequently this bot? This is going to offend somebody, I know, because we say things at funerals, and this is the sort of thing that you don't correct somebody when they're grieving, typically with something like this. I understand all of that. We say things that are just they kind of come off. But so often at a Christian funeral, you'll hear, "Thank goodness they're done with that body. It's gone. They've shed it. It's like the body was bad. Now they've become something more. They're whether they're an angel or whether they're just free of that body." There's a bifurcation that I think Luther is keying in on here because that's I think how we see the grave.
Yeah, I mean, and so you can certainly appreciate the fact that someone whose body has been riddled with cancer, that broken, fallen, cursed body is no longer something that is causing them pain and suffering, right? And
Absolutely.
so there's a goodness in that. And yet, the greater goodness is that body has been sown as a seed and they will be raised again. The loss of joy, the loss of pleasure that they had in a bodily experience because of the curse, because of cancer, let's say, they will no longer experience that, yes, in the presence of God, but also in the resurrection. And I do think that this is part of, recovering death means recovering a real hope in the resurrection, that it's not just something that we kind of use as a platitude, but it really is, the reality of the Christian life.
Yeah.
And so I do think, I mean, Augustine is another one. I don't have the quote in front of me, but I was always struck in the City of God when he talked about the body of the dead person, the body of the dead mother. These were the breast that nursed the child. And there's something intrinsically and always sacred about that body, even when it is wrapped in, funeral cloths and is buried in the ground. And I think we just do not appreciate that today.
Yeah. So how do you encourage this? So, you are a theologian, but also a pastor. How do you encourage this in churches? I mean, I'm thinking toward, again, don't go maybe pester the pastor tomorrow and ask him to build a graveyard for you. But like, you mentioned the body and recovering like a theology of the body. How can churches be thinking in that regard? Because again, I do think this is just like the resurrection is one of the most neglected aspects of eschatology that we talk about. So too is this doctrine of the body and the goodness of God's creation that will be redeemed, restored, like you said, cured of the cancers and ills that befall us. But what are some ways Christians can encourage this within their church, do you think?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think just a recovery of understanding creation, the doctrine of creation, the doctrine of nature. I mean, I spent, 8 weeks preaching a series called The Business of Isness, just talking about ontology in very biblical terms. And so, in fact, Founders has picked that up, and that will, Lord willing, be a book that's published this summer, because I'm trying
Awesome.
to help people to think about, the message of salvation is never salvation from creation. It is the salvation of creation, right? It is the fact that God had to take on human form in the Son, in Jesus Christ, in order to die and to rise again. So there's something that is there, making much of the Lord's table. Right? The gospel is not just words; it is words that have now, with bread and wine, are reminding us of this reality. It's embracing and encouraging men and women to accept the bodies that they have. Right. And that's not just, to fight against transgenderism in our day, but it's to say, look, to a young woman, the body that God has given to her is for nourishing life. It is not to be killing life. It is not for the defense of a nation in the military, I mean, according to nature, but rather it is to give life, that is there. So embracing these bodily realities really can apply at every aspect of life.
Yeah. And I'm glad you brought up I'm glad you brought up the Lord's table because that's one again Christians can disagree over some of the particulars on the table, but I think that message that we should all be able to embrace is that like that's a visceral meal in which
Mhm.
we celebrate the goodness of Christ's broken body on our behalf and the resurrection of that body. Like that the fact that we take, whether your church takes communion, weekly or monthly or even farther apart than that, however your church does that should be a ready-made opportunity to speak not just of what Christ has done on our behalf, but how our bodies will be raised. I think for most churches that should be a ready-made communication of the goodness of creation, not in the fact that it's not stained with sin, but in the fact that God has made something good that He is redeeming, including our bodies, which will be raised.
Yeah, I think that's
Um,
right. And I would say to the person, and there are different traditions who will do this, but whether it's monthly communion or quarterly or whatever it is, I would really challenge it. Why not every week? When we, as we all did, experienced kind of the COVID hiatus, and our church was not gathering for 8 weeks, and it's our conviction you cannot take the Lord's Supper unless you're gathered together as a church body with one another. And so we didn't take the Lord's table, and we, told our people not to take the Lord's table on their own in their own, locked down places where they were. But when we gathered again, because we had had the practice of taking the Lord's Supper one Sunday out of the month, when we came back, we took it the first Sunday, and we've taken it ever since. We had to backfill on some of the teaching that was there. We were already of the mind that this is something that we should do, but we just moved in that point to say, look, we're not guaranteed next week. We thought we were guaranteed next week. We're not guaranteed next week.
mhm.
And so when the Lord's people gather together, we're to sing, we're to pray, we're to preach, we're to hear the word of God read. We are to take the Lord's Supper. So that was for us one way to do that. And what that does is it reinforces the physical nature of the body and the blood of Jesus Christ. And when you don't do that every week, again, you may be missing an opportunity to kind of emphasize the bodily nature of what Christ has done.
Yeah, that incarnational aspect. Yeah, I think a good line of question with something like that is there a good reason not to? I think that's a solid way to look at it if it's a good thing. Let me ask you one other thing, and if I'm missing anything that you guys covered in the article, please bring it up. But there was on point number two, you mentioned it being formative for pastors and churches, this aspect of a graveyard.
Yeah.
Um, I suspect there's a lot there. I don't know what you would want to key in on, but I know for the way again, my mind went to this graveyard near my wife's house where she grew up. And I was thinking of, they would ride their bikes through there when they were kids. This was before I knew her, but they would ride their bikes through and with all the things that are usually associated with a graveyard, right? I worry, we turned on, it was actually a Marvel movie the other day. We repented afterward, but we turned on a Marvel movie.
Depends on which one it is.
Well, yeah, it was one to be repentant of, but it started. There was just some like witchcrafty type stuff that started popping up, and I immediately, we stopped it for a minute, and I was just thinking of the formative effect that has on my kids. Now, again, like I know media is hard, and parents have to make tough choices, but at the same time, like there's a formative effect even as a kid on you come through a graveyard. You're sort of reckoning with things whether you mean to or not, which I think speaks to the power of media as well, but that would take us off topic a bit. But there's a formative effect there. What were you guys keying on with that a formative effect of a graveyard for pastors and for churches?
Well, yeah. So even to say that a church has a graveyard, you should do this, you're still going to have to teach to that and teach from that, right? Because, I can imagine a pastor saying, look, we've had a graveyard at our church the whole time we've been here, and it's meant nothing, right? It was filled a long time ago, whatever the case may be. It's like, yeah, so in the same with the Lord's Supper, you can go through that in a rote way that you're not teaching your people that, or you can be very instrumental to say, no, this is something that we do, and here's why we do it.
Yeah.
Right. So anyone who's to say, okay, let's plant a graveyard, here are the reasons for that. And if you have that, then it's something to continue to make a means of informing and encouraging the people who are there.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, the other day, we missed church or we were because of snow, something like that. And I simply said, the church building that we have is a gift from God. We shouldn't overlook that. We shouldn't assume that we have this church building, because if we didn't have a church building, we're still called to gather. So that would mean one of our homes or a field or something to that effect. But in God's kindness, He's provided this building, and therefore we should be good stewards of it. And we should, give thanks to the fact that we can be in a heated place to that end. Like we can just run past through that and, not think about that at all. Or we can take the time to slow down and realize, okay, this is a gift that God has given to us. And how many churches are there in the world that are praying for, are saving for, are working towards a building? And again, there's sinful ways that there can be too much focus on a building. Yet there's sinful ways that we can just ignore a building
Yeah.
at the same time. And so I think taking those physical things and allowing them to be points of object lessons for us in our walk with Christ.
Isn't it funny how this stuff like because as you could substitute in graveyard there and put in creeds and confessions or
Yeah, yeah.
public prayer in the church. This is often our reaction, and that's not to knock people that if you've seen it where it's just rote practice, I can understand that being like, well, I don't want it to be that, and yes and amen. But anything can be that. I'm going to go home today, and Lord willing, my wife will be there. I will get there, and I'm going to give my wife a kiss when I get home. That it doesn't have to lose its meaning. Now I could come home and just give her, a cold peck on the cheek or something. It could lose its value. But yeah, it's interesting how these things they're so frequently tied up with the kind of warp and woof of Christian living. This should be something that doesn't lose its value. And if it's lost its value, that's not an error with the graveyard or with the confession or with whatever it might be. That's just us handling it improperly. Um, it's so interesting. What did I miss? Anything else that popped up for you guys as you were looking at graveyards? Because I'm fascinated by this, and I'm especially fascinated by churches getting together for like a common aim in that regard. I feel like that could go a long way. And I wonder how often that's the
We can't
case.
agree with our doctrine in life, but we can agree with our hope in death.
Hey,
Right.
take the win, brother. Yeah,
That's right.
that's one we could take the win on.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. Anything else though that we're missing with kind of the themes that came up there?
Yeah. I mean, so all of these in some ways are kind of creations in the abstract, because I don't know anyone who's necessarily doing this.
Right.
I think it's a right thing to do. I think it's a right thing to discuss. I know of at least one person who responded afterwards, said that their church is thinking through these things, and I said, "That's great. Do it, and then write the book." Because
Help us
like
out a little bit.
yeah, I mean, because I can only imagine there are zoning regulations that
Yeah.
would be challenging. I can imagine there would be county supervisors who would not want you to do this. I can imagine that there are costs involved, there's stewardship involved, there's upkeep involved. I mean, there's all sorts of reasons not to do this. And yet, I think there's still good reasons to do it.
Yeah.
And so that's where it's like, hopefully, this article will incite that kind of conversation. And if a church in the future says, yeah, this prompted us to think about this, we're doing this, it would be a joy and pray that we would be good stewards of it.
Okay. Do you have time for like one more? Okay, I know I want to be cautious with your time because I know we got a late start, but I had one that came up as you were talking. I wonder how this intersects with conversations of sphere sovereignty and authority. So this is what I'm kind of thinking of. I don't want to derail things because you just gave us a really good closing. Now I'm going to mess it up by posing a question. But no, I'm thinking of this seems like it is properly the stewardship of the church. And when I say that, I don't mean that the church must or it's in sin. I'm just saying that like were the church to step out and say it is now our job to set speed limit signs in our town, we would probably cry foul and say, I don't think that's actually what God has tasked the church with. However, stewardship of the grave and what comes after the grave. Obviously God is the one who holds these things, and yet we're the ones I think you could make the biblical argument that are to steward in that regard. Just as the family is called to care for the raising of their children, the care of their elderly. Whether you bring in or have a third party that helps with that, that's up to the family, right? But like that would be a family responsibility. I'm called to raise my children in the fear and admonition of the Lord. If I bring in others to help me, that's great, but it's my responsibility. Could you make the argument that this is the purview of the church? This is what the church has been tasked with.
Yeah. I think it's something that the church can take up, and I think their sovereignty over their membership is something that would be a helpful thing to think about how to do this. Because if you do this, you're going to run into all sorts of challenges.
Yeah.
You do this for the community that you're in. It's one thing if you're in a 5,000 person town. It's another thing if you're a 500,000 person county or something like that.
Yeah.
Uh, Certainly, and again, just to use the illustrations around here, I know of family plots that are all around our area. You have church graveyards, and then you have, kind of county graveyards or county cemeteries, or even you think about the military cemeteries. So you have Arlington National Cemetery, which for me is just, a few miles down the road. It's like death. Death doesn't care about your sovereignty or your sphere sovereignty, right? I mean, in some sense, like it's going to impact all of us. So whether it's a family that's doing it, a church that's doing it, or a nation or a county that's doing it, it's like you're going to have to do something with that. But what you think about death is going to have a tremendous impact on what you do, right? Again, I can imagine a family that worships their ancestors keeping the parts of the body in order to be able to continue to commune with the dead. I
Right.
can think of a nation that is, if it's purely secular and pagan, they may, just burn the bodies and care nothing about them, or they may honor the dead who have fallen in battle or something like that. But again, you go to Arlington National Cemetery, and they're all filled with crosses because there's a way in which Christianity has influenced the way that our country has thought through those things. So, yeah, I think it would be an interesting conversation to think about how sphere sovereignty works out.
Yeah.
But the truth is that it doesn't matter what those are, like death is coming. And so here's an opportunity for the church to bear witness because it's not the family as the family, the nation as a nation. It's the church, the people who know and worship Christ, who are able to bear witness to the resurrection that is to come.
Yeah. No, that's a good word. We can land the plane here, but let me commend again Christ over all, and it was planting a graveyard. 7 reasons churches should recover an ancient practice, and that's by David Schrock and Nate Hendrickson. So, Dave, always a pleasure, brother. Thanks for hopping on and yeah, sharing some of this eschatological hope with us.
Always fun, brother. Thanks, man.
Seated here at my right hand, the Lord to my Lord did command, for of these heathen I will make a kingly footstool for your sake.